Grace Morningstar's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel, engine idling as she stared at the impossible sight before her. Three small figures stood motionless beside a hand-painted sign reading "Orphans, $50 each," burlap sacks tied over their heads like executioners' hoods. The youngest child shouldn't have known her name. "Grandmother Grace," the tiny voice whispered in Cherokee through the coarse fabric, freezing every conversation in the dusty reservation square. Murmurs died. Boots stopped shuffling. Even the auctioneer's practiced patter faltered mid-sentence, his red face draining of color as he stared at the hooded boy. Grace's breath caught. Her husband Robert had called her that same endearment 20 years ago, when they dreamed of grandchildren who never came. Now this stranger child spoke words that carved straight through her chest, awakening something fierce and protective she'd buried with Robert 3 winters past. "Ma'am, you buying or not?" the auctioneer stammered, sweat beading despite October's bite. How could this child know her heart's deepest wound? And why did every adult in that crowd suddenly look away? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Grace Morningstar had learned to measure her life in empty spaces. The passenger seat of her rusted Ford pickup where Robert used to sit, humming old Johnny Cash songs. The second coffee mug she still pulled from the cabinet each morning before remembering. The silence that filled their small ranch house like stagnant water, broken only by the tick of the mantel clock Robert had carved from Wyoming pine. At 52, she carried herself with the careful posture of a woman who'd learned that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. 3 years of widow's benefits had barely kept the mortgage current, and her job teaching 3rd grade at the Wind River Elementary had evaporated last spring when budget cuts swept through the reservation like a prairie fire. Now October's chill carried the scent of desperation. 60 days until foreclosure, $847 in her checking account, and winter approaching with the inevitability of bad news. The Wind River Reservation stretched across 2 million acres of Wyoming's high desert, home to the eastern Shoshone and northern Arapaho tribes. Grace belonged to neither exactly. Her Cherokee grandmother had married an Irish railroad worker, creating a bloodline that never quite fit anywhere completely. She'd found her place here through Robert, a full-blood Arapaho who'd seen past her mixed heritage to the woman underneath. Together, they'd built a life of quiet contentment on 40 acres, where the sagebrush grew thick and the Absaroka Mountains painted purple shadows across endless sky. The auction today had been a last resort, selling Robert's tools, his saddle, anything that might buy another month's grace period. She'd driven into Ethete expecting to leave with empty hands and a lighter truck bed, not to witness children being sold like livestock in America in 1995 as if the 19th century had never ended. The 3 boys stood with the practiced stillness of abuse victims, hands bound behind their backs, breathing visible in the crisp air. The eldest appeared maybe 12, all sharp elbows and defiance despite his restraints. The middle child kept his head tilted as if listening for danger, but it was the smallest one who'd stopped her heart. 6 years old at most, wearing clothes 2 sizes too large and shoes held together with duct tape. Grandmother Grace. The words echoed in her mind, spoken in the old language with perfect pronunciation. Her Cherokee wasn't common knowledge around here. Hell, she barely spoke it herself anymore. Just fragments her grandmother had whispered during childhood visits to Oklahoma. Yet this child had called her by a name only Robert had used, in a language he shouldn't know. The auctioneer, Tom Briggs, shifted nervously as Grace approached. She recognized him from the feed store, a man who'd sell his own shadow if the price was right. "These boys been through 3 homes already," he warned. "Might be more trouble than they're worth." Grace studied the children, noting the way they instinctively moved closer together when adults approached. Someone had trained that fear into them, and the thought made her Cherokee temper flare hot and dangerous. Grace pulled $800 from her worn leather wallet, counting out 20s with the deliberate care of someone who knew the exact weight of each bill. "I'll take all 3, she said, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd spent 20 years teaching children to believe in themselves. Tom Briggs blinked twice, his calculator brain working overtime. "Ma'am, that's only 800. Sign says 50 each, but there's administrative fees, processing costs. You're looking at 200 per head, minimum." "The sign says 50, Grace repeated, stepping closer. At 5'6", she didn't tower over anyone, but 3 decades on the reservation had taught her how to make her presence felt. "Unless you're calling yourself a liar in front of half the town." The crowd had grown uncomfortably quiet. Agnes Crowfeather, 83 and sharp as winter wind, watched from beside her grandson's truck with the intensity of a hawk. Mary Windwalker stood near the general store, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Even Sheriff Tom Bradley had materialized from somewhere, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt like a man expecting trouble. Briggs wiped sweat from his forehead despite the October chill. "Look, lady, these boys ain't house-trained. Don't talk much neither. Haven't eaten since yesterday morning, per the seller's instructions. You don't know what you're buying." "I know exactly what I'm buying," Grace said, pressing the bills into his reluctant palm. "They're freedom." The knife work was quick and efficient. Briggs cut the rope binding their hands first, then reached for the burlap sacks. Grace had delivered calves in snowstorms and set broken bones with veterinary tape, but nothing had prepared her for the faces that emerged from those rough hoods. The eldest boy had pale green eyes that held too much knowledge for 12 years. A thin scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, and when he flexed his hands, Grace noticed calloused palms that spoke of hard labor. He didn't flinch when the sack came off, just stood straighter and scanned the crowd like a soldier assessing threats. The middle child had intelligent brown eyes that darted between faces, cataloging expressions with the survival instincts of someone who'd learned to read danger in adult moods. His clothes hung loose on a frame that suggested regular meals were a recent memory. But it was the smallest boy who made Grace's breath catch. Davy, though she didn't know his name yet, looked directly at her with dark eyes that seemed far older than his 6 years. His black hair stuck up in cowlicks, and a gap-toothed smile flickered across his face like sunlight through storm clouds. "Thank you, grandmother," he whispered in Cherokee, the words so soft only Grace could hear them. The crowd rustled like wind through dry leaves. Someone coughed. A woman muttered something about unnatural and devil's work. Sheriff Bradley shifted his weight, hand resting on his radio. Grace knelt to Davy's eye level, her knees protesting against the packed dirt. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Davy," he said in English this time, his voice barely audible. "Davy Little Wolf." "And you too?" Grace asked, looking at the older boys. "Joey," the eldest said, his voice rusty with disuse. "Joey stands tall. This is my brother Mikey." He placed a protective hand on the middle boy's shoulder. "I'm Mikey Running Bear," the 9-year-old added, speaking for the first time. His voice carried the cadence of someone who'd been reading books when other kids were playing outside. Grace stood slowly, her knees crackling like kindling. "Well, Joey, Mikey, and Davy, I'm Grace Morningstar, and you're coming home with me." The ride back to her ranch passed in silence, thick as morning fog. The boys sat in the truck bed, despite her invitation to crowd into the cab, huddled together against the wind that carried the promise of early snow. Through her rear window, Grace watched them watch the landscape roll past, 40 miles of sagebrush and scattered cattle, the Wind River cutting silver ribbons through brown grassland, and finally the dirt road that led to her gate. Her house sat small and weathered against the vast sky, a 2-bedroom ranch style that Robert had built with his own hands. The barn leaned slightly eastward, giving in to 30 years of Wyoming wind, and the corral fence needed mending before winter settled in for good. It wasn't much, but it was paid for, almost. The boys climbed down from the truck bed with the careful movements of children who'd learned not to make sudden gestures around adults. They stood in her gravel driveway, three small figures dwarfed by the endless horizon, and Grace felt something shift in her chest, like a rusty gate finally swinging open. "You hungry?" she asked. Three nods, synchronized and eager. "Then let's see what we can find." The boys refused to enter the house. Grace stood on her front porch, holding the screen door open while three pairs of eyes stared back at her with the wariness of animals that had learned to associate enclosed spaces with pain. Joey's hand rested protectively on Davy's shoulder, and Mikey positioned himself where he could see both the house and the road, classic survival positioning that made Grace's teacher instincts flare with recognition. "It's okay," she said, letting the door swing shut. "We'll eat outside." She brought ham sandwiches and milk to the porch steps, setting the food on a wooden crate Robert had used for his fishing gear. The boys approached like deer coming to water, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. They ate with the focused intensity of chronic hunger, barely tasting the food as they consumed it. "Where did you boys come from?" Grace asked, settling into Robert's old rocking chair. Joey finished his sandwich before answering. "Sacred Heart Children's Home," he said, the words carrying bitter weight. "Father Sullivan's place, up near Dubois." Grace knew the name. Everyone on the reservation did. Father Marcus Sullivan ran what was supposed to be a model facility for troubled Native youth, funded by Catholic charities and praised in the Casper Star-Tribune for its innovative approach to child welfare. Politicians visited for photo opportunities. Social workers spoke glowingly of the transformation they witnessed in the children. "How long were you there?" Grace asked. "Too long," Mikey said quietly. "Some kids never leave. They just disappear." Davy had finished his milk and was drawing patterns in the dust with a stick. Without looking up, he said in Cherokee, "The shadow man comes at night. He takes the ones who remember their families." Grace felt ice form in her stomach. "What did he say?" Joey translated reluctantly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He said, Father Sullivan takes kids who won't forget where they came from." The sound of an approaching vehicle cut through the afternoon quiet. Grace recognized the white Ford Explorer before it reached her driveway. Sheriff Tom Bradley's personal truck, not his patrol car. Behind him came a black sedan with government plates and a tall man in a priest's collar riding passenger. "Inside," Grace said firmly. "Now." For the first time, the boys obeyed without hesitation, disappearing through her front door like smoke. Grace remained on the porch, rocking slowly as the vehicles pulled to a stop beside her mailbox. Father Marcus Sullivan stepped from the sedan with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to deference. He stood 6'3", silver-haired and handsome in the way that made people trust him instinctively. His black shirt and white collar were immaculate despite the dust, and his smile radiated the kind of warmth that politicians spent millions trying to fake. Sheriff Bradley looked less comfortable, his bulk shifting from foot to foot as he approached the porch. Tom had been Robert's fishing buddy for 15 years, and Grace could read the conflict in his weathered face like a book written in large print. "Afternoon, Grace," Sullivan said, his voice carrying just enough authority to remind everyone present of his position in the community. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I have 3 boys who were being sold like livestock in the town square," Grace replied, continuing to rock. "If they belong to you, Father, then you need to explain why they were on the auction block." Sullivan's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his pale blue eyes. "Those children are wards of Sacred Heart. They wandered away from a supervised outing. I'm afraid they're quite troubled, Mrs. Morningstar, prone to fabrication and manipulation. It's why they've been through so many foster placements. The man with government plates stepped forward, extending a leather folder. Janet Morrison, Department of Family Services. Father Sullivan has legal custody of those children, ma'am. I'm going to need you to release them to his care. Grace accepted the folder without opening it. And if I refuse? Then we'll have to involve law enforcement, Sullivan said, his tone remaining pleasant while his words carried unmistakable threat. Sheriff Bradley has been very patient, but harboring runaway minors is a serious offense. Tom Bradley cleared his throat uncomfortably. Grace, I don't want any trouble here. These boys need professional help, and Father Sullivan's facility has a reputation, Grace finished. I've heard the stories, Tom. Kids who go in broken and come out different. Sullivan's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something predatory beneath the pastoral facade. Mrs. Morningstar, grief can cloud our judgment. I understand you're lonely since Robert's passing, but these children aren't pets to be collected. They require specialized care that you simply cannot provide. The mention of Robert's name in that patronizing tone ignited something dangerous in Grace's chest. She stopped rocking and stood slowly, her 5'6" frame somehow seeming to fill the entire porch. "Get off my property," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a woman who'd spent 30 years teaching teenagers to respect boundaries. Sullivan's smile returned, colder now. "I'll be back, Mrs. Morningstar, with a warrant, if necessary. God works in mysterious ways, but He doesn't allow His children to remain in inappropriate environments indefinitely." As the vehicles pulled away, Grace noticed Janet Morrison looking back through the rear window with an expression that seemed more worried than angry. Something about that glance suggested there were complications to this situation that even the government worker didn't fully understand. Grace waited until the dust settled before calling the boys back outside. They emerged slowly, and she noticed how Davy pressed close to her legs while Joey scanned the horizon for additional threats. "What happens now?" Mikey asked. Grace looked down at 3 faces that had already seen too much of the world's cruelty. "Now we figure out how to keep you safe." That first night, Grace found herself lying awake at 2 in the morning, listening to the sounds of children who had learned not to sleep deeply. Soft whimpers drifted from the living room where the boys had insisted on bedding down together near the fireplace, close to both the front door and the back exit. She'd offered them the spare bedroom, but Joey had shaken his head firmly. "We stay together," he'd said. "Always." By dawn, Grace had made coffee and was scrambling eggs when she heard the screen door creak open. Davy padded into the kitchen barefoot, his hair sticking up in impossible directions, clutching a worn stuffed horse that had seen better decades. "Morning, sweetheart," Grace said softly. "You hungry?" Davy nodded, climbing onto one of Robert's handmade kitchen chairs. "Grandmother Grace," he said in Cherokee, then switched to English. "Why do you have Grandfather Robert's pictures but no children pictures?" The question hit like a physical blow. Grace's hand trembled as she set down the spatula, eggs forgotten. On the kitchen wall hung a dozen framed photographs, her and Robert on their wedding day, fishing trips, Christmas mornings, family gatherings. But Davy was right. Not a single image showed children in their home. We couldn't have babies," Grace said finally, the words scraping her throat raw. "We tried for 15 years, but God had different plans." "That's why you're sad inside," Davy observed with the brutal honesty that only children possess. "Your heart has empty places." Before Grace could respond, Joey and Mikey appeared in the doorway, both boys alert and assessing the emotional temperature of the room with the practiced efficiency of survivors. "Everything okay?" Joey asked, his 12-year-old voice carrying the weight of a father's concern. "We're fine," Grace said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Just talking about family." Over breakfast, the boys began revealing fragments of their story. Joey showed Grace the brand burned into his shoulder. a small cross that made her stomach turn with revulsion. Mikey demonstrated his ability to read by sounding out headlines from Robert's old newspapers, a skill he'd developed in secret because Father Sullivan discouraged literacy among the children. He said reading made us proud, Mikey explained. Pride was the devil's work. Davy finished his eggs and wandered to the living room, where he began examining Robert's belongings with the focused attention of an archaeologist. He picked up Robert's favorite coffee mug, a ceramic piece decorated with fishing flies that Grace had bought him for their 10th anniversary. Grandfather Robert liked his coffee black, Davy said suddenly. 2 sugars on Sunday mornings. He hummed when he was happy. Grace's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor. How could you possibly know that? The boy's dark eyes held depths that seemed far too old for 6 years. I just know things sometimes. When I touch stuff, I can see pictures, like movies in my head. Joey and Mikey exchanged glances that spoke of previous conversations about their youngest brother's unusual perceptions. It's not magic, Mikey said quickly. Father Sullivan said Davy was touched by demons, but that's not true. He just notices things other people miss. Grace knelt to clean up the broken ceramic, her mind racing. She'd heard stories from her Cherokee grandmother about children born with special sensitivity to the world beyond the physical, but she'd always dismissed them as old superstitions. Now, watching Davy handle Robert's possessions with reverent care, she wondered if some gifts transcended rational explanation. The second day brought unwelcome visitors. Grace was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she noticed dust clouds on the horizon, 2 vehicles approaching fast. She called the boys inside and watched through her kitchen window as Sheriff Bradley's patrol car pulled up alongside a black pickup truck she didn't recognize. Tom Bradley climbed out of the patrol car looking like a man who'd swallowed something unpleasant. The pickup disgorged 2 men in suits who moved with the predatory confidence of people accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. "Grace," Tom called from her front yard. "Need to have a word." She stepped onto the porch, aware of 3 pairs of eyes watching from behind her living room curtains. "What can I do for you, Tom?" "These gentlemen are from the State Department of Family Services," Tom said, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man reading from a script he didn't believe. "They have some questions about the children in your care." The taller of the 2 suits stepped forward, flashing a badge with practiced efficiency. "Ma'am, I'm Agent Warren Campbell. We've received reports that you may be harboring runaway minors without proper authorization. I'm going to need to inspect your premises and interview the children." "You got a warrant?" Grace asked. Campbell's smile reminded her of the rattlesnakes that sometimes sunned themselves on her back porch. Cold and potentially lethal. "We don't need a warrant for child welfare checks, ma'am. These boys are considered at-risk minors, and we have legitimate concerns about their safety." "Their safety was threatened when they were being sold like cattle in the town square," Grace replied. "They're safe here." "That's not your determination to make," Campbell said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "You're not a licensed foster care provider. You have no legal standing to house these children." Tom Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "Grace, maybe it's best if you just let them talk to the boys. Get this sorted out properly." Before Grace could respond, her screen door opened and Joey stepped onto the porch. At 12, he barely reached Grace's shoulder, but something in his bearing made all 3 men take notice. "We're not going back," Joey said, his young voice carrying absolute conviction. "Not to Father Sullivan. Not to anyone who hurts kids." Campbell crouched to Joey's eye level with the false friendliness of an adult who thought children were easily manipulated. "Son, nobody wants to hurt you. Father Sullivan is very worried about you and your brothers. He just wants to make sure you get the help you need." "The help he gave us before?" Joey pulled up his shirt, revealing the branded cross on his shoulder. "Or the help he gave Tommy Crow Dog before Tommy disappeared?" The name hit Tom Bradley like a physical blow. Tommy Crow Dog had been reported missing from Sacred Heart 6 months earlier. Father Sullivan claimed the boy had run away to live with relatives in Montana, but Tommy's grandmother insisted no such relatives existed. "That's a very serious accusation," Campbell said, his friendly mask slipping. "Do you have any proof of abuse?" "Look at us," Mikey said, appearing beside his brother. "Look at how skinny we are. Look at the scars. Look at how we flinch when adults move too fast." Campbell stood slowly, his expression hardening. "Mrs. Morningstar, these children have clearly been coached to make false allegations. I'm ordering you to release them to our custody immediately." "And I'm ordering you to get off my property," Grace replied. "Unless you have a court order signed by a judge, these boys stay with me." Campbell pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number. "Father Sullivan?" "Yes, it's Warren. We have a problem." The conversation lasted 3 minutes and consisted mostly of Campbell saying, "Yes, sir," and "understood." When he hung up, his smile had returned, colder than before. "You have 24 hours to voluntarily surrender these children," Campbell said. "After that, we'll be back with law enforcement support and court orders. I suggest you use that time to consider what's really in these boys' best interests." After the vehicles disappeared down her dirt road, Grace sank into Robert's rocking chair and tried to think clearly. 3 faces looked up at her with the patient expectation of children who had learned that adults usually disappointed them. "What's going to happen to us?" Davy asked in Cherokee. "I don't know yet," Grace admitted. "But I promise you this. I won't let anyone hurt you again." That evening, Grace called the only lawyer she knew, David Crow Dog, a Lakota attorney who practiced family law in Lander. David had handled Robert's will and had been fighting reservation legal battles for 20 years. "Grace?" David's familiar voice carried warmth and concern. "Heard you've got yourself in a situation." "David, I need help. Real help." She explained the entire story, the auction, the boy's revelations about Sacred Heart, Father Sullivan's threats, and the government agent's ultimatum. David listened without interruption until she finished. "Grace, this is bigger than a simple custody dispute. If these boys are telling the truth about abuse at Sacred Heart, we're talking about federal crimes. But proving it will be nearly impossible without corroborating evidence." "What kind of evidence?" "Medical records showing abuse, financial documents proving illegal adoptions, testimony from other victims, the kind of evidence that men like Father Sullivan are very good at making disappear." Grace felt despair settling over her like a heavy blanket. "So there's nothing we can do?" "I didn't say that," David replied. "But we need to be smart about this. I'm going to make some calls. I know people in the FBI who specialize in crimes against children. Meanwhile, you need to document everything these boys tell you. Names, dates, specific incidents. If we're going to war with Father Sullivan, we need ammunition." After hanging up, Grace found the boys in the living room where Davy was showing Joey and Mikey a wooden box he'd discovered under Robert's desk. "This was Grandfather Robert's treasure box," Davy announced, speaking with the certainty of revelation. "He kept his most important secrets inside." Grace's heart stopped. She'd searched everywhere for Robert's personal papers after his death, finding only the basic documents needed for probate. But there sat a carved wooden box she'd never seen before, hidden in a space too small for her adult hands to reach. "Where did you find that?" "Behind the secret drawer," Davy said matter-of-factly. "Grandfather Robert showed me in my dream." With trembling hands, Grace opened the box. Inside lay a thin leather journal, several manila envelopes, and a letter addressed to her in Robert's careful handwriting. The letter was dated 3 days before Robert's death. Grace's hands trembled as she unfolded Robert's letter, his familiar handwriting blurring through her tears before she could focus on the words. "My dearest Grace, If you're reading this, then my suspicions about Father Sullivan were correct, and someone didn't want me sharing what I'd discovered. I've been investigating missing children from our reservation for 8 months now, and what I've found will make your blood run cold. Sacred Heart isn't a children's home. It's a distribution center. Sullivan has been adopting native kids to wealthy families across the country who want exotic children but don't want to go through legal channels. The price is $50,000 per child. The younger and more pure-blooded they appear, the higher the fee. I have evidence hidden in our bedroom wall behind the loose board near your side of the bed. Bank records, communications, even photographs. Agnes Crow. Feather's grandson Tommy didn't run away to Montana. He was sold to a family in Connecticut. Same with the Windwalker girl, the Two Bears boy, and 47 others over the past 5 years. Grace, if something happens to me, take this evidence to FBI agent Sarah Runningwolf in Billings. She's been building a federal case but needs more proof. Don't trust anyone local. Sullivan has people everywhere. I love you more than all the stars in the Wyoming sky. Take care of yourself, and if God willing, maybe someday you'll get the chance to protect children the way we always dreamed. Your devoted husband, Robert. The journal contained meticulous notes in Robert's careful handwriting, names, dates, financial transactions, and detailed observations about Sacred Heart's operations. Grace read page after page of evidence that painted Father Sullivan not as a man of God, but as the mastermind of a sophisticated child trafficking network. Joey read over her shoulder, his face growing pale as he recognized names. "That's Danny Whitehorse," he whispered, pointing to an entry dated 6 months earlier. "He was at Sacred Heart when we got there. Father Sullivan said he went to live with his uncle in California." "According to this," Grace said, her voice tight with rage, "Danny was sold to a family in Beverly Hills for $60,000. Mikey had found the manila envelopes and was carefully examining their contents. Bank statements from Sacred Heart showed regular deposits of enormous sums, far more than any legitimate children's home could generate. Transfer records detailed movements of children with clinical efficiency, names, ages, physical descriptions, and delivery locations. Davy sat quietly in the corner, holding Robert's coffee mug and staring at nothing. Suddenly he spoke in a voice that sounded older than his 6 years. Grandfather Robert was driving to meet someone at Copper Creek Bridge. It was dark. He had papers in a brown envelope. Someone was waiting for him. Grace felt ice form in her stomach. "Davy, what are you seeing?" The bad man was there, the shadow man from Sacred Heart. Grandfather Robert tried to run, but the car went into the water. Davy's eyes focused on Grace with startling clarity. "It wasn't an accident, Grandmother. The shadow man pushed Grandfather Robert off the bridge." The room fell silent except for the tick of the mantel clock. Grace had always been told that Robert's death was a tragic accident, that he'd lost control on the icy bridge and crashed through the guardrail into Copper Creek. But if Davy was right, if Robert had been murdered for his investigation... A sound outside broke the heavy silence. Vehicle engines approaching fast. Grace moved to the window and saw headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. 3 vehicles this time, including Sheriff Bradley's patrol car and Father Sullivan's black sedan. "Boys, grab your things," Grace said urgently. "We're leaving. Now!" "Where are we going?" Joey asked, already helping Mikey gather their few possessions. "Somewhere safe while we figure this out." Grace stuffed Robert's evidence into a grocery bag and grabbed her truck keys. "There's a back trail that leads to Agnes Crow Feather's place. We can cut through the sagebrush and—" The sound of splintering wood interrupted her as the front door exploded inward. Father Sullivan strode into her living room, flanked by Agent Campbell and 2 men Grace didn't recognize. Large, professional-looking individuals with the bearing of private security. "Mrs. Morningstar," Sullivan said, his pastoral mask completely dropped to reveal the predator beneath. "I'm afraid this charade has gone on long enough." Sheriff Bradley followed reluctantly, his hand resting uncomfortably on his weapon. "Grace, these men have a court order." Federal jurisdiction. Campbell held up an official-looking document. "Emergency removal order signed by Judge Harrison in Cheyenne. These children are considered endangered in your care." Grace positioned herself between the men and the boys, who had instinctively clustered behind her. "Let me see that order." "There's no time for legal reviews," Sullivan said smoothly. "These children need immediate medical evaluation. We have reason to believe they've been subjected to psychological manipulation and possible abuse during their time in your custody." The accusation was so audacious, so perfectly calculated to turn the situation upside down, that Grace could only stare in amazement at Sullivan's brazenness. "You're accusing me of abusing them?" Grace asked incredulously. "Look at the evidence," Sullivan continued, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being believed. 3 traumatized children, clearly malnourished, making wild allegations against respected community institutions. A mentally unstable widow living in isolation, desperate for companionship. The signs are textbook. Joey stepped forward, his young voice cutting through Sullivan's manipulation like a blade. "Show them your shoulder," he called to one of the security men. "Show them the same mark you gave me." The man's hand moved instinctively to his shoulder, and Grace saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or guilt. "That's Marcus," Mikey whispered urgently. "He worked at Sacred Heart. He's the one who held us down when Father Sullivan used the branding iron." Sullivan's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing something cold and desperate underneath. "These children have been coached to make these accusations. Their traumatic experiences have made them susceptible to suggestion and fantasy. Funny thing about trauma," Grace said, surprising herself with her steady voice. "It leaves evidence." She pulled out her cell phone and speed-dialed the number David Crow Dog had given her. "Agent Running Wolf? This is Grace Morningstar. I have Robert Morningstar's evidence. And I have 3 witnesses to Father Sullivan's crimes. You need to get here now." Sullivan moved faster than Grace expected, lunging forward to grab her phone. But Davy was faster, darting between the adults and tripping the priest with the precision of someone who'd learned to use his small size as a weapon. Sullivan went down hard, his head striking the coffee table with a sickening crack. For a moment the room froze as everyone processed what had happened. "Father!" Agent Campbell knelt beside Sullivan, who was conscious but dazed, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "He killed my grandfather," Davy said in Cherokee, his small voice carrying absolute conviction. "I saw it in his shadow." Sheriff Bradley had drawn his weapon, though he seemed unsure where to point it. "Grace, this has gone too far. These children need professional help." "You're right, Tom," Grace agreed. "They need help recovering from what Father Sullivan and his people did to them. Joey, show Sheriff Bradley your shoulder." Joey hesitated, then slowly pulled up his shirt. The branded cross was unmistakable, fresh enough to be recent, precise enough to be intentional, and clearly not self-inflicted. Tom Bradley's face went white. "Jesus Christ, Grace. Who did this to you, son?" "Father Sullivan," Joey said simply. "He said it would help us remember who we belong to." The security men were backing toward the door, clearly recognizing that the situation had shifted beyond their control. Campbell was still kneeling beside Sullivan, who had managed to sit up despite his obvious disorientation. "This is all very convenient," Campbell said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "These children could have been branded anywhere by anyone, without corroborating evidence." "You mean evidence like this?" Grace held up Robert's journal and the manila envelopes. "Bank records showing Sacred Heart receiving $50,000 per child. Transfer documents with your signature on them, Agent Campbell. and photographs of children who were supposedly returned to their families but are actually living with wealthy buyers in California, New York, and Texas. Campbell's face went gray. "Where did you get those documents?" "My husband died protecting them," Grace said. "Robert Morningstar was investigating your operation when he had his accident at Copper Creek Bridge." Sullivan struggled to his feet, supported by one of his security men. Blood had dried on his forehead, but his eyes had regained their predatory focus. "You have no idea what you're interfering with, Mrs. Morningstar. This goes far beyond your small understanding." "Then enlighten me," Grace challenged. "These children were nothing before we found them," Sullivan said, his mask finally slipping completely. "Abandoned, abused, unwanted. We gave them purpose. We found them families with the resources to provide proper care." "You sold them like livestock," Grace shot back. "We facilitated adoptions for families who couldn't navigate the bureaucratic maze of traditional services," Sullivan corrected. "Families who were willing to pay premium prices for children with specific characteristics." The casual way he discussed human trafficking made Grace's stomach turn. Specific characteristics? "Native heritage is very fashionable among certain collectors," Sullivan explained with chilling matter-of-factness. "Pure bloodlines command the highest prices. Young children adapt more easily to their new environments." Joey had gone very still beside Grace, his face pale with understanding. "You killed Tommy Crow Dog because he wouldn't stop trying to escape." Sullivan's smile returned, cold and triumphant. "Tommy Crow Dog was defective merchandise. Some children adapt to their new circumstances, others don't." The sound of approaching sirens cut through the night air, growing louder as they drew closer to Grace's ranch. But Sullivan didn't seem concerned. If anything, his confidence appeared to be returning. "I'm afraid you've made a serious miscalculation, Mrs. Morningstar," Sullivan said. "Those sirens aren't bringing rescue. They're bringing cleanup." The sirens belonged to 3 patrol cars from the county sheriff's department, their red and blue lights painting Grace's living room in alternating waves of color. But instead of the relief Grace had expected to feel, a cold dread settled in her stomach as she watched the officers emerge from their vehicles with military precision. These weren't rescue responders. They were cleanup crew. Sheriff Bradley stepped forward to meet the arriving officers, his body language suggesting coordination rather than surprise. Grace watched through her window as he spoke quietly with the lead deputy, gesturing toward her house with the casual authority of someone who'd planned this moment. "You see, Mrs. Morningstar," Sullivan said, dabbing at the blood on his forehead with a handkerchief, "corruption is remarkably easy when you control the right people. Sheriff Bradley has been very cooperative over the years. His gambling debts made him quite amenable to supplemental income." Grace felt the last of her hope crumble. If she couldn't trust local law enforcement, if the very people sworn to protect children were part of Sullivan's network, then she and the boys were trapped with no way out. "What do you want?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Simple," Sullivan replied. "You're going to suffer a tragic accident, carbon monoxide leak, perhaps, very common in older homes with faulty heating systems. The children will be found overcome with grief, clearly traumatized by witnessing your death. They'll require immediate psychological intervention at Sacred Heart." Joey moved closer to Grace, his young hand finding hers. "We're not going back," he said, but his voice carried less conviction than before. "Oh, but you are," Sullivan smiled. "You see, after tonight's trauma, no one will question your need for specialized care. The brand on your shoulder will be explained as self-harm brought on by psychological distress. Your stories about Sacred Heart will be dismissed as fantasy created by an unhinged mind seeking attention." Mikey had been quietly examining the evidence scattered on Grace's coffee table. Suddenly he looked up with the focused intensity of someone who'd just solved a complex puzzle. "Agent Campbell," Mikey said, his 9-year-old voice cutting through Sullivan's monologue. "You're not really with the Department of Family Services, are you?" Campbell's mask of official authority flickered. "Of course I am, son. I have proper identification." "Your badge number is wrong," Mikey continued with the relentless logic of a child who'd learned to survive by noticing details adults missed. "Real DFS badges in Wyoming start with the letters WY. Yours starts with MT, Montana." Grace looked more closely at Campbell's credentials and realized Mikey was right. The badge looked official, but the formatting was subtly wrong, the kind of mistake someone might make when creating convincing forgeries. "Smart boy," Sullivan said, sounding genuinely impressed. "Yes, Agent Campbell works for a private adoption agency that specializes in difficult placements. His credentials are quite convincing to anyone who doesn't look too closely." The front door opened and Sheriff Bradley entered with 2 deputies Grace didn't recognize. Their uniforms looked right, but something about their bearing suggested they weren't local law enforcement. "Situation secure?" one of the deputies asked Sullivan directly, bypassing Sheriff Bradley entirely. "Nearly," Sullivan replied. "We just need to stage the scene and transport the children." Grace realized with crystalline clarity that she and the boys were about to die. Not quickly and not painlessly, but with enough plausible deniability that the official investigation would conclude tragic accident rather than murder. Sullivan had done this before, probably many times. "Wait," Grace said, desperately trying to buy time. "If you're going to kill me anyway, at least tell me why. Why target Native children specifically?" Sullivan's eyes gleamed with the fervor of someone who'd rationalized his evil as righteousness. "Native children are particularly valuable in the adoption market," he explained with clinical detachment. "Wealthy families pay premium prices for the exotic appeal, but they want children young enough to be molded, traumatized enough to be compliant." "You're talking about human beings," Grace said, revulsion thick in her voice. "I'm talking about unwanted children finding purpose," Sullivan corrected. "These boys were headed for lives of poverty, addiction, and despair on the reservation. We offer them futures with families who have the resources to provide proper care." "By torturing them first," Joey said, his young voice carrying devastating accuracy. "By breaking down their resistance to adaptation," Sullivan replied without shame. "Children who remember their original families never fully bond with their new ones. We simply help them forget." Davy had been silent throughout this exchange, but now he stepped forward with the fearless directness that only children possess. "You're going to hell," he announced in Cherokee, then repeated it in English for everyone present. Sullivan laughed, the sound completely devoid of warmth. "Hell is a superstition for people who need external motivation to behave morally. I create my own morality." "No," Davy said with startling conviction. "You're already dead inside. I can see it in your shadow." For the first time since entering Grace's house, Sullivan looked genuinely unsettled. Something about Davy's absolute certainty seemed to penetrate his narcissistic armor. "Enough!" Campbell said, clearly wanting to move the situation toward its conclusion. "Let's finish this." One of the fake deputies produced a small canister from his equipment belt. "Carbon monoxide cartridge," he explained to Sullivan. "Crack it open in the furnace room, seal the house, and they'll be unconscious in 20 minutes. Grace looked at the 3 boys who had somehow become her entire world in just 4 days. Joey stood straight despite his fear, determined to protect his brothers even in the face of certain death. Mikey continued examining details with the focused intensity of someone trying to solve his way out of an impossible situation. And Davy was smiling. "What are you grinning about, boy?" Sullivan demanded, clearly disturbed by the child's unexpected expression. Because, Davy said in Cherokee, then switched to English, the real police are already here. As if summoned by his words, the sound of additional vehicles filled the night air. But these weren't more county patrol cars. Grace could hear the distinctive rumble of federal vehicles, and through her window she saw the unmistakable outline of FBI tactical gear. Sullivan's face went white as the reality of his situation crashed down on him. The transformation in Father Sullivan's demeanor was instantaneous and terrifying. The mask of civilized authority that he'd worn for decades cracked completely, revealing something primitive and desperate underneath. His pale blue eyes darted between the approaching FBI vehicles and the children like a cornered predator calculating odds of escape versus the satisfaction of destroying his prey. "If I can't have them," Sullivan snarled, producing a snub-nosed revolver from beneath his clerical collar, "then no one can." The weapon looked wrong in his hands, incongruous with the religious vestments that had been his disguise for so many years. But the way he held it, steady, practiced, confident, suggested this wasn't the first time Father Marcus Sullivan had pointed a gun at defenseless children. Agent Campbell and the fake deputies scattered, their survival instincts overriding any loyalty to Sullivan's cause. Sheriff Bradley raised his hands and backed toward the door, his face a mask of terror as he realized his corrupt bargain had led him into a federal crime scene. "Easy now, Father," Bradley stammered. "Let's not do anything we can't take back." "Take back?" Sullivan laughed, the sound carrying the brittle edge of complete mental breakdown. "Tom, I've been taking children for 15 years. I've sold over 200 native kids to the highest bidders. I've killed anyone who got too close to the truth, including this woman's husband. What exactly do you think I could take back at this point?" Grace positioned herself in front of the boys, her body forming a human shield between Sullivan's weapon and the 3 lives that had become more precious to her than her own existence. "You want to shoot someone?" she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "Then shoot me." "But you leave these children alone." "Oh, I intend to shoot you," Sullivan assured her with chilling calm. "But first, I want you to understand exactly what you've cost me. Do you have any idea how much money moves through Sacred Heart? 50,000 per child minimum. More for the young ones, the pretty ones, the ones with pure bloodlines." Through the window, Grace could see FBI agents deploying with tactical precision around her property. Spotlights blazed to life, turning her small ranch into a miniature daylight that cast harsh shadows across Sullivan's increasingly unstable features. "My operation spans 7 states, Sullivan continued, seeming to gain energy from his own confession. "Judges, social workers, law enforcement, adoption agencies. I own them all. Sacred Heart was just the distribution center. The real money comes from the private auctions." "Auctions?" Grace felt sick imagining what that meant. "Wealthy buyers fly in from all over the world," Sullivan explained with the pride of someone describing a successful business venture. "We hold them in abandoned warehouses, old mining facilities, places where screams don't carry. The children are displayed, examined, tested for compliance. The bidding can get quite competitive." Joey's hand found Grace's, his small fingers squeezing with desperate strength. "He's lying," the 12-year-old whispered. "He wants us to be scared." "No, son," Sullivan said, having overheard. "I want you to understand that your suffering has been profitable. The trauma, the branding, the systematic breaking of your spirit, all of it increases your value to certain collectors who enjoy damaged goods." The front door exploded inward as FBI tactical agents flooded into Grace's living room. Red laser dots danced across Sullivan's chest and forehead, but he kept his revolver trained on the children with unwavering focus. "Federal agents," shouted a woman's voice. "Drop your weapon immediately." "Agent Sarah Running Wolf, I presume," Sullivan said without lowering his gun. "Robert Morningstar mentioned you in his pathetic little investigation. I should have killed you years ago." A tall Native American woman in tactical gear stepped forward, her own weapon trained on Sullivan with professional precision. "Father Sullivan, you're surrounded. Release the children and surrender peacefully." "Surrender?" Sullivan's laugh was completely unhinged now. "Agent Running Wolf, I've been building this network for 15 years. I have buyers in 12 countries and political protection that reaches to Washington, D.C. Do you really think your little federal task force can destroy what I've created?" "Your network is finished," Agent Running Wolf replied with calm authority. "We've arrested 47 of your associates across 8 states. Your financial records have been seized. Sacred Heart is currently being searched by forensics teams who will find enough evidence to put you away for life." Sullivan's face flushed with rage. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. These children were better off in my system than rotting on this godforsaken reservation. I gave them purpose." "You tortured them," Grace said, her teacher's voice cutting through Sullivan's delusions with devastating clarity. "You branded them like cattle and sold them to people who would abuse them further. That's not purpose. That's evil." "Evil?" Sullivan's voice rose to a near shriek. "I saved these children from lives of poverty and despair. I found them families with resources, education, opportunities they never would have had." "By erasing their identities," Mikey said, with the devastating logic of a 9-year-old who'd lived through Sullivan's salvation. "By making us forget our real families. By hurting us until we were too scared to remember who we really were." Sullivan's gun swung toward Mikey, and Grace's heart stopped. But before he could pull the trigger, Davy stepped forward with the fearless conviction that had defined him from their first meeting. "You're already dead," Davy announced in Cherokee, then repeated it in English. "I can see death in your shadow. It's been following you for years." Something about Davy's absolute certainty seemed to shake Sullivan more than all the FBI weapons pointed at his head. His hand trembled for the first time, the revolver wavering between targets. "Shut up," Sullivan whispered. "You don't know anything, you little freak." "I know you killed your own son," Davy continued with the brutal honesty that only children possess. "He drowned because you were too busy selling other people's children to watch your own." The revelation hit Sullivan like a physical blow. His face went white, then flushed purple with rage. "How could you possibly know about—" "Because I can see it in your shadow," Davy repeated. "Your son is there, watching you. He's ashamed of what his father became." Sullivan's mental breakdown accelerated visibly. Tears streamed down his face as 15 years of rationalization crumbled in the face of a 6-year-old's devastating insight. "Michael was everything to me," Sullivan whispered, the gun shaking violently in his grip. "When he died, God took away the only pure thing in my life. So I decided to collect other pure things, to save them from the corruption of this world." "By corrupting them yourself," Agent Running Wolf observed. "By preparing them for better lives," Sullivan screamed. "By breaking down their resistance to adaptation, by making them grateful for any kindness shown to them." The confession was complete now, witnessed by federal agents and recorded on multiple devices. Sullivan had just admitted to 15 years of systematic child abuse, trafficking, and murder, but he still held a loaded weapon aimed at 3 children who had somehow become Grace's entire world. "It's over, Father," Agent Running Wolf said gently. "Put down the gun and let these children go. You've done enough damage." Sullivan looked around Grace's living room, at the federal agents, at the evidence scattered across her coffee table, at the 3 boys who had somehow triggered the collapse of his entire operation. His eyes finally settled on Grace herself, and she saw something that chilled her more than his earlier threats. Acceptance. "You're right," Sullivan said with sudden calm. "It is over. But if I can't have my collection, then no one can. His finger tightened on the trigger, and Grace realized with crystal clarity that Sullivan intended to kill all three boys before turning the gun on himself. In that moment, maternal instinct overrode rational thought. Grace Morningstar, 52-year-old widow and former schoolteacher, launched herself at a man holding a loaded weapon. The revolver discharged as they collided, the gunshot deafeningly loud in the small room. Grace felt something hot tear through her shoulder, but adrenaline kept her fighting as she and Sullivan crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs and desperation. More gunshots rang out as FBI agents opened fire. But Grace was too focused on wresting the weapon away from Sullivan to process anything beyond the immediate struggle for survival. When the shooting stopped, Father Marcus Sullivan lay motionless on Grace's living room floor, his pale blue eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Grace knelt beside him, her shoulder bleeding but functional, and felt nothing but relief that the monster who had terrorized so many children would never hurt anyone again. 3 years later, Grace Morningstar stood in her expanded kitchen, watching through the window as 15 children played in the yard of what was now officially known as the Morningstar Children's Ranch. The morning sun painted the Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and amber, and the sound of laughter drifted through the screen door like music she'd never thought she'd hear in her home. Joey, now 15 and nearly as tall as Grace herself, was teaching a group of younger children how to properly saddle one of the ranch horses. His branded shoulder had faded to a pale scar, but more importantly, the haunted look had disappeared from his eyes. He'd found his calling in helping other rescued children adapt to life at the ranch, serving as both big brother and living proof that healing was possible. Mikey had just turned 12 and had developed into something of a scholar, devouring every book Grace could find and helping tutor the other children. His reading skills, once hidden for survival, now flourished openly. He'd recently started corresponding with a professor at the University of Wyoming who was documenting the stories of trafficking survivors for a book that would expose the full scope of Sullivan's network. Davy, 9 now and taller but still impossibly wise for his age, had become the ranch's unofficial emotional barometer. His unusual ability to sense when children were struggling with trauma had proven invaluable in helping newcomers adjust. He no longer spoke of seeing shadows or death. Those dark visions had faded along with the immediate danger that had triggered them. The legal aftermath of Sullivan's death had been swift and comprehensive. Agent Sarah Running Wolf's federal task force had dismantled the entire trafficking network, resulting in 127 arrests across 14 states. The financial assets seized from Sacred Heart and its associated organizations had funded not only the Morningstar Ranch but also similar facilities on 12 other reservations nationwide. Grace herself had been cleared of all charges and officially recognized as a hero by both tribal and federal authorities. The bullet wound to her shoulder had healed cleanly, leaving only a small scar that she wore with pride. A reminder of the night she'd chosen to fight for children who needed protection. More importantly, the investigation had revealed the truth about Robert's death. Sullivan's confession before his final breakdown had been corroborated by evidence found in Sacred Heart's records. Robert Morningstar had indeed been murdered for getting too close to exposing the trafficking operation. His life insurance company had been forced to pay triple damages, and the state of Wyoming had issued a formal apology for the mishandled investigation. Sheriff Tom Bradley had been arrested for corruption and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. His cooperation with prosecutors had helped identify other law enforcement officials who'd been compromised by Sullivan's money, leading to a complete overhaul of child protection services across the region. The ranch itself had grown from Grace's modest 2-bedroom house into a proper facility capable of housing 20 children and 6 full-time staff members. The new buildings blended seamlessly with the original structure, maintaining the feeling of home rather than institution. Each child had their own room, but communal spaces encouraged the family atmosphere that Grace believed was essential to healing. David Crow Dog, the lawyer who'd helped Grace through the legal maze, had become both legal counsel for the ranch and Grace's closest friend. At 55, he was a widower himself, and their relationship had evolved slowly from professional cooperation to genuine affection. And they were talking about marriage, quietly, privately, with the understanding that any decision would need to work for all 15 children who now called the ranch home. The most surprising development had been Davy's revelation about his true identity. DNA testing conducted during the federal investigation had confirmed what Grace's heart had somehow known from the beginning. Davy was indeed her biological grandson, the son of a daughter she'd given up for adoption 23 years earlier. His birth mother had been murdered by Sullivan's associates when she'd tried to reclaim her son, but not before hiding him with a foster family where he'd lived for 2 years before being recruited by Sacred Heart. The knowledge that she'd found her own grandson in that group of trafficked children seemed too miraculous to be coincidence, but Grace had learned to accept that some things transcended rational explanation. What mattered wasn't how they'd found each other, but what they'd built together. As Grace watched the children play, she thought about the words Davy had spoken to her on that first terrifying night. "Grandmother, broken things can be made beautiful again." He'd been right, though none of them could have imagined how completely their broken pieces would fit together to create something stronger and more beautiful than any of them had dared to dream. The Morning Star Ranch had become more than a home for rescued children. It had become a symbol of hope, proof that love and determination could triumph over even the darkest evil. And Grace Morningstar, who'd once measured her life in empty spaces, now counted her blessings in the sound of children's laughter echoing across the Wyoming plains. At 52, Grace Morningstar thought her chance at motherhood had passed forever. Like so many of us in our golden years, she'd accepted that certain dreams simply weren't meant to be. Her house echoed with silence, her dinner table set for one, her heart carrying the weight of what if and if only. Sound familiar? But sometimes life has other plans. When Grace saw 3 children being sold like livestock, something fierce awakened in her. Not just maternal instinct, but the recognition that it's never too late to become who we're meant to be. Those children didn't just need rescuing. They needed someone who understood that family isn't about blood, it's about showing up when the world falls apart. Grace discovered that her empty nest wasn't an ending. It was preparation for the family she was always meant to protect. At 55, she became mother to 15 children and grandmother to countless more through the ranch that bears her name. Her story reminds us that our greatest chapters might still be unwritten, that the love we have to give doesn't diminish with age, it deepens, becomes richer, more intentional. Sometimes what we thought was our ending is actually our beginning. What dreams have you put aside thinking it's too late? How might your life experience make you uniquely qualified to help others? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to take that brave first step.